On a quiet flight in the middle of the night, no one expected that in just 2 short minutes, a black doctor would be slapped in the face in front of dozens of people, and the woman who did it would be kicked off the plane on the spot. But what silenced the cabin wasn't the slap. It was the way the man responded. No words of anger, no retaliatory gestures, just a calm look and a small photo he pulled out of his old wallet. What really happened on that flight? And why did that seemingly small moment touch the hearts of millions of people later? It was a late weekday evening. The sky above Dallas was a deep purple twilight, the airport lights twinkling as if trying to hold on to a long day that had just passed. Flight AA712 was about to take off for San Francisco, a 3-hour flight that seemed like any other. But for some on board, tonight would be an unforgettable crossing point. In row 12A, Dr. Evan Cole, a black neurosurgeon, was quietly leaning his head against the plane window. He had just finished a 16-hour surgery. His eyes were tired but still shining with a clear, determined look. Inside the pocket of his blouse was still a faint blue ink stain, a small but real touch, a witness to the haste of not having time to change clothes after a long shift. In his leather wallet, next to his ID and bank card, was a small folded piece of paper. A doodle, drawn by his son, of a man in a blouse holding the hand of a smiling child. Evan always carried it with him, as a silent reminder that beyond the sky, there was a small heart waiting for him to return. Evan is not an emotional man, but those who have met him sense a deep calm, a peace forged through every hour of surgery, every life or death moment he has faced with his patients. But tonight, something was different. The air in the cabin seemed thicker than usual. Not necessarily from fatigue, but as if a thin layer of mist was creeping between people, between eyes and actions. Cassie, a flight attendant of about 27, strode down the aisle. She had the angular beauty of a photo model, but her face was always tense, as if she had never really breathed. Cassie had only been in the business for a short time, and her eyes were a mixture of professional effort and constant anxiety, as if afraid that the slightest mistake would cost her this fragile position. She checked each row, her gaze moving quickly, but not indifferently. When she passed Evan's row, her steps faltered for a moment. He was leaning his head back, eyes half closed, his hands resting lightly on his knees, looking almost asleep. The loudspeaker sounded softly, reminding passengers to fasten their seatbelts and prepare for takeoff. Outside the window, darkness had already covered the runway. Evan opened his eyes slightly, feeling the plane begin to move. A small sigh escaped him, not from exhaustion, but as a way of reassuring himself that in just a few hours he would be home, kissing his son on the forehead and hearing his son ask, "Did you save anyone today?" In that fragile moment of silence, no one knew that just a few minutes later, an incident would occur, something seemingly small but would shake the entire plane cabin, putting Evan and Cassie in two opposite positions that no one expected. The flight settled into cruising altitude, the engine noise becoming a steady, distant whisper in the background, making everything in the cabin feel almost silent. Passengers began to relax. Some put on headphones, some leaned over to watch a movie. Others closed their eyes and leaned their heads back as if wishing the journey ahead would go by faster. Evan remained in the same position, arms crossed over his chest, eyes half closed. His broad shoulders shifted slightly as if trying to stretch after a long day. His small black carry-on bag, not a large one, was neatly placed under the seat in front of him, the straps bulging out slightly, probably from the haste with which he had stowed his luggage. And then, a soft but sharp female voice rang out beside him. "Sir, your luggage is a little out of place in the footwell. Could you please move it a little?" Cassie stood there, the yellow light from the ceiling casting a strained expression on her face. Her lips were pressed together, her eyes lacking the friendly air of a flight attendant. She was trying to maintain her dignity, but the way she stood, the way her hands were clasped together at her waist, it was as if she was holding something back. Evan immediately bent down, gently pulling the strap of his bag inward, his voice low, deep, and sincere. "I forgot. My mind was still wandering around the operating room." It was a polite remark, and to most people it was just a light retort. But something in Cassie's eyes shifted. Her face changed, for some reason. Maybe it was the a little long that reminded her of the fatigue she wasn't allowed to show. Or maybe it was the casual tone, which unintentionally made her feel slighted. She didn't respond, not even a smile, not even the usual nod when a flight attendant completes a small request from a customer. She turned away almost immediately, walking quickly, almost hurriedly, as if wanting to escape that air. The hem of her uniform fluttered lightly over the back of the chair, leaving behind her a vague, tense breeze. Evan frowned slightly, either because of the reaction or because the exhaustion hadn't left his mind yet. He didn't think much of it. His eyes glanced down at the picture in his wallet, the folded piece of paper he'd taken from his jacket pocket and placed in his palm, an anchor that pulled him back to reality, keeping him in the same calm state he'd kept so many times on the operating table. However, not everyone is so calm. A man sitting in the back row, middle-aged with reading glasses, had seen the whole thing. His eyes followed Cassie as she walked briskly toward the back of the compartment, then turned back to Evan. No one said a word, but in that instant, a budding tension had crept into the air, like a tiny crack in glass, almost invisible, but threatening to shatter at any moment if hit just right. The lights in the cabin were soft, the engine hummed like a steady lullaby. Evan leaned his head back slightly, his eyes half closed in a fragile moment between wakefulness and sleep. His breathing was slow, not because of relaxation, but because of the fatigue from the surgery 16 hours earlier. His heart was still heavy with the image of his little son sleeping on the desk, waiting for his father to come home. The blouse was now off, but the smell of hospital, the smell of antiseptic still lingered on the cuffs of his shirt. The blue ink stain on his chest was the last vestige of a day without breathing. Suddenly the footsteps became clearer, staccato and decisive. Cassie? The young flight attendant returned. It was no longer the light footsteps of a passenger attendant, but the hard-hitting footsteps as if she were approaching someone who had just committed a crime. Standing right in front of Evan, she looked at him with a tense gaze, her voice suddenly higher than necessary, almost harsh. "Sir, I asked you to move the bag. Why didn't you listen?" Evan slowly opened his eyes, his brows furrowed, not in anger, but in undisguised confusion. At that moment, he had no idea what was happening, since the bag had been adjusted earlier. He replied calmly, still maintaining the polite demeanor of a doctor used to dealing with emergency situations in the operating room. "I did. Is something wrong?" The answer was like a small drop of water falling into a calm lake, and then a huge wave suddenly came crashing down. Without warning, without forewarning, Cassie, her face furious, suddenly swung her arm and slapped Evan across the face. The sound echoed through the silent cabin, as if someone had shattered a fragile piece of glass in midair. A woman sitting across the row blurted out, "Oh my God, did she just—" The other passengers raised their heads, and a few phones were immediately pulled out by reflex. Evan's face tilted slightly to one side because of the slap, but what stunned everyone was not Cassie's action, but the strange calmness in his eyes when he turned back to face her. No anger, no fear, not a single word came out. Only a deep silence, like a storm that made no sound, but was raging fiercely inside. The slap did more than just land on a man's cheek. It was like a sudden spark that lit a quiet plane cabin, sparking looks of disbelief and shock, and starting a wave of unexpected change. For a moment after the slap, no one spoke. The air was filled with a thick sense of shock and injustice. Evan's cheeks were red, the handprints were clear, but his eyes were as calm as the ocean in a storm. He didn't respond, didn't stand up, and didn't look at Cassie, who had just attacked him in front of so many eyes. Instead, his hand quietly opened his wallet, pulling out a frayed piece of paper, a crayon drawing. A picture of a man in a blouse, holding the hand of a boy with curly hair and a bright smile. The crooked words below were shaking with childish ink. "Daddy is my hero." He looked at the paper, as if he were trying to find the most solid part of himself in a time when hurt and humiliation could easily overwhelm him. No one saw him breathe heavily, but there was something deeper in his eyes, the calm of someone who knows they don't need to speak loudly to prove their worth. Then, a voice rang out. Not loud, but clear, steady, and without hesitation. "I saw it all." The middle-aged woman in the second row stood up, Her hair was dark brown, her glasses perched on her nose, and her voice had the sharp edge of someone accustomed to using words to force the truth to speak. That was unprovoked assault. I'm a civil rights attorney, and I'm willing to give a full statement. Cassie turned, startled, her eyes wide. The passengers all around the cabin immediately turned to Lisa, the woman who had spoken. But that was not all. In the window seat, a young man with brown hair, headphones on, held up his phone, still recording video. "I've got the whole thing, front to end," he said, calmly but clearly, "and I'm saving it to the cloud right now." The atmosphere in the cabin changed instantly. It was no longer Cassie who had the upper hand. No longer were the vague, suspicious looks. Now they were clear, focused on her, not hateful, but cold, with a demand for justice. A flight attendant was called in. Her face was filled with concern as she heard the story. The captain arrived shortly afterward, personally speaking with Lisa and checking the video Ben had just recorded. Whispers began to spread across the rows like small waves crashing against the shore. The pieces of the story were coming together. And now, the story was no longer in the hands of the cabin crew, but the concern of the entire flight. Meanwhile, Evan still didn't say a word. He just folded his son's drawing paper and carefully put it in his wallet, as if to keep a last belief in humanity. He understood that sometimes the silence of a kind person is what makes the whole world speak for him. What was originally a flight from Dallas to San Francisco became a contest between power and truth. And in less than 2 minutes after that slap, the tides of power had turned. The captain, a man in his 50s with a stern but not cold expression, stood in the middle of the cabin, his eyes scanning the faces of the passengers, as if to make sure he hadn't missed anything in the tense atmosphere. After watching the video from Ben's phone, listening to Lisa's brief but pointed testimony, and glancing at Evan, who had yet to say a word to justify or claim justice for himself, he took a deep breath, then nodded slowly. "Cassie," he called, his voice low, not angry but no longer forgiving. "I need you off the plane. Now." The whole cabin was silent. Cassie stood still for a moment, her eyes wide with disbelief. She glanced at the flight attendant for a look of support, a word of defense, but received only a slight shake of the head and a tired silence. Cassie swallowed, then walked slowly toward the door. Each step was heavy, like stepping on her own fears, but tinged with bitterness, not from regret, but from the feeling that the world had turned its back on her. When she was only a few steps away from Evan, she stopped, her lips trembling slightly, her eyes looking at no one in particular, only saying one sentence, both an excuse and a cry for help from the deepest part of someone who had never been healed. "You don't know what it's like, being disrespected, all the time." A murmur arose here and there. Some frowned, some shook their heads, but no one intervened. Evan looked up at her, his eyes not filled with anger, nor even satisfaction. There was something kind and strong, the quiet strength of those who choose to maintain their dignity, even when they are most vulnerable. "You don't get to project your pain onto strangers," he said slowly but clearly, each word like a mirror, returning the truth that Cassie had been trying to avoid for so long. No one said anything more. Cassie bowed her head, not protesting. She walked on, her gait no longer haughty, but heavy, like the burden of a soul both broken and naked before its own mistakes. The plane door closed behind her, gently but firmly. And once again, the silence fell. But this time not from shock, but from a sense of justice restored. Without noise, without retaliation, just from the truth seen, and the resilience of someone who doesn't need to shout to be heard. The plane was quieter than ever after Cassie left. The sound of the engines still echoed steadily, but every whisper had faded into the distance, as if everyone was waiting for something to end the suffocating feeling that hung between the ceiling and the floor. Evan sat still in the chair, his body frozen in the moment, his back against the chair, but his shoulders still slightly tensed. His eyes were no longer looking at anything in particular. They were silently looking through the small window, where the night sky stretched endlessly outside, distant, vague, and perhaps as cold as the void that was slowly forming inside him. He couldn't close his eyes, even though he wanted to. Every time he closed his eyelids, the woman's face would appear again, the hurt and resentful look, the sudden slap like a wave hitting the memory he had tried to forget, that his skin color, his composure, even his kindness, were sometimes misunderstood, underestimated, or worse, perceived as a threat. A soft voice rang out beside him, as light as the wind touching his shoulder. "You didn't deserve that. None of it." Evan turned. Lisa, the woman who had stood, who had not been silent, looked at him with a gentle gaze, without pity but without explanation. There was empathy distilled from experience, integrity that did not need to be shouted, and an affirmation that somewhere, justice still lived, in people who dared to speak the truth when others chose to remain silent. Evan nodded slightly, as if to say thank you without words. But then, something unexpected happened. From behind, a small hand reached out, slipping between the seats. In the palm was a sticker, a bright red heart, slightly wrinkled, the edges peeling, that any adult would consider meaningless. Except Evan. He turned around. The child was about 5 or 6 years old, with big round eyes and a face that was both familiar and distant. For a moment, his heart clenched. The child had the same eyes as his son, innocent, unjudgmental, unhesitant. It was just a gesture, giving his heart in the most innocent way. Evan took the sticker with both hands, like it was a precious gift. He smiled, not loudly, not forced, but a real smile, the first since the series of confusing, painful, unfair things had just happened to him. He gently put the sticker in his wallet, next to his son's scribbles, 2 small pieces that contained the world of love he always carried with him. And for the first time since the plane took off, he closed his eyes. Not to escape, but to breathe. Deeply. Somewhere, in the air and darkness, invisible wounds are beginning to heal. With kindness. That night, as the flight landed in San Francisco and the footsteps began to leave the plane, Evan sat still. He was not in a hurry, did not look at his watch, nor did he rush to get his luggage like everyone around him. He just quietly watched the people passing by, each face, each expression, as if he was searching for something that could not be named. Or perhaps, he was just feeling the silence within himself. But it is not an empty silence. It is the stillness after the storm, where people are no longer caught up in protests or anger, but begin to see small pieces of courage, of humanity, of kindness, in a sea of seemingly indifferent life. Because tonight, Evan witnessed more than just injustice. He also witnessed something even rarer. The quiet courage of strangers, a woman who stood up to testify for what was right, a man who quietly recorded evidence, and a boy who gave away a paper heart as an unlikely form of healing. And perhaps the most unexpected thing was Cassie. She didn't turn back to the plane, didn't say another word after that last sentence. But something inside her cracked in that moment, like a mask finally cracking. Not everyone has the courage to face their pain. Cassie had lived in the shadow of judgment, of unhealed wounds, of the constant fear that she would always be overlooked. But tonight she couldn't ignore it anymore. She couldn't blame. She couldn't keep avoiding it. Because sometimes healing doesn't start with punishment. It starts with accountability. Responsibility to look at ourselves, to own up to what we have done, not to beat ourselves up, but to start over, properly. Evan didn't call the press. He didn't share the video online. He didn't want to be famous for a slap or become the unwilling symbol of mass anger. Because for him, true victory has never been about spreading justice. It's about peace. It's about going home, opening your wallet, looking at your son's doodle, and knowing that you've kept yourself intact. And that is the greatest reward. A reward that no slap, no insult can take away. A reward that does not need noise, does not need applause, only a heart quiet enough to feel. Not every wound is visible, and not every fight is loud. Tonight, on a seemingly anonymous flight, one person chose dignity over anger. Another, forced to confront the deepest part of himself. And the rest, the anonymous witnesses, proved that courage does not require a title, only a heart that knows right from wrong. Perhaps the most precious thing we can give each other is not perfection, but the moment we look at each other without prejudice. When a small action, a look, a word, a child's paper heart, can become the support for someone to rise from brokenness. And if there was one thing Evan Cole took with him from that night, it wasn't anger. It was peace. The peace of knowing he did the right thing. The peace of a father who can still return home, look into his son's clear eyes, and smile. Thank you for listening. If you have ever witnessed a moment of kindness in this fast-paced world, please share it in the comments. Who knows, you might be an inspiration to someone else on their journey to healing.